And we'll get started. Thank you to everyone for joining us for this webinar on the important topic of building partnerships to address Indigenous homelessness. We know that Indigenous peoples are highly overrepresented in the homelessness population and that communities will need to work together, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous partners. Today, we will be hearing about the very thoughtful work that's been happening in Toronto to co-create and implement the Meeting in the Middle engagement strategy and action plan to more meaningfully and effectively address Indigenous homelessness. We'll begin with a land acknowledgement. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. I'm located in Kitchener, Ontario, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Neutrals peoples, whose presence on these lands continues to this day. And I encourage you to, I see some folks are putting their acknowledgements in the chat. I encourage you to do that, or just to pause for a moment and acknowledge the land that you are from. My name is Marie Morrison. I am the Director of Built for Zero Canada with the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and I am your host for today's webinar. I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers for today. Steve Teekins, who's the Executive Director for NAMERES, the Native Men's Residence, where he has worked since 2008. He's been working with marginalized and homeless sector in Toronto since 1995. He is a member of the Nipissing First Nations. He has a master's degree in public administration from Queen's University. Steve is very active in Toronto's Indigenous community, where he volunteers at the Toronto Aboriginal Social Services Council and the Aboriginal Legal Services Community Council program. He also teaches traditional drumming to the youth and men at various Native organizations inside and outside of Toronto, and enjoys working and volunteering in the Indigenous community and wishes to see people overcome their obstacles and find the resilience in themselves to succeed in life. We also have Linda Wood, who's the manager with the City of Toronto Shelter Support and Housing Administration Division, responsible for providing strategic direction and leadership for the planning and implementation of the Street Needs Assessment, Toronto's point-in-time count and needs assessment survey that supports improved services delivery to people experiencing homelessness. She is also the lead for the Shelter Support and Housing Administration's Meeting in the Middle engagement strategy and action plan, which has been co-created with Toronto's Indigenous Community Advisory Board and the Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council to more meaningfully address Indigenous homelessness in Toronto. So super pleased to have them here today and thank them for their time and sharing. Before we jump into our presentation today, though, just wanted to provide a bit of background information and housekeeping. This webinar is being brought to you today from the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, which leads a national movement of individuals, organizations, and communities working together to address homelessness in Canada. It includes the 5 key initiatives that you see listed here. This webinar is part of a series of monthly webinars and community practice calls through the Alliance that has been taking place since the fall of 2019 and goes to March of 2022. The calendar for September to December has been released. You can now find all webinars and community practice calls, both those coming up and previous ones, on the Canadian Alliance Training and Technical Assistance website. These webinars are funded in part by the Government of Canada through the CCI funding stream of Reaching Home. And I'm not going to read all the detail on the slide, but I have included and linked in relevant information from both the Reaching Home directives and the Community Homelessness Report Guide that makes it clear that engagement and co-creation with Indigenous communities is expected in the development of communities' Reaching Home Community Plan, Coordinated Access, HIFAS, and the Community Homelessness Report. We have attempted to pull together in one place what we hope are helpful resources related to Indigenous homelessness and the work that's happening in communities to address, reduce, and end Indigenous homelessness. This is what the page looks like with the drop-downs included. And the Meeting in the Middle report is included under the Community Plans drop-down, and we'll make sure that this webinar is linked in there as well. Certainly, if you know of other resources that we could add, please reach out to myself or info@ch.ca. Know that today's webinar is being recorded and it will be sent out to all those who have registered, and then it will also be posted on the Training and Technical Assistance website. Everyone is muted, but really encourage you to use the chat and the Q&A functions throughout. I'll be monitoring those, and then we can raise those questions and have a bit more discussion at the end of the presentation. And I've been told that closed captioning has been turned on to this webinar, but I am not seeing it listed. But you may be able to, because it's been enabled, to activate it for yourselves as you are watching. All right, with no further ado, I am going to turn it over to Steve and Linda, and I'll just advance the slides as we go through the presentation today.
All right, wonderful. Bonjour, Josh Bojejiwang Nabe, Manadona Nanis Nakaz Wabshi Shido Dem, Nibising Nudunjaba. I just said greetings in the Ojibwe language. My name is Steve Teekins. I'm with the Martin clan from Nipissing First Nation, and happy to be here. I'd like to say good morning to those of you in the West, and also good afternoon to those of you in the East. So pleasure to be here today, and yeah, thank you for the kind introduction as well. So we're going to talk to you about this engagement plan that the Indigenous community members of Toronto and city staff from the division from Shelter Support Housing Administration had come together to collaborate on, and how we created this working document to help create a better working relationship between both Indigenous community and working with the city to help alleviate homelessness. So I'm going to turn it over to Linda to give a brief introduction of herself.
Thanks, Steve. Hello, everybody. My name is Linda Wood. I'm a white settler of mixed European background, privileged to have been involved in the co-creation of the Meeting in the Middle Engagement Strategy and Action Plan, and the sort of lead.
Uh-oh, we lost Linda. Uh-oh.
To have been working with Indigenous organizations in the housing and homelessness sector for the past.
Linda, your internet, I think, is cutting in and out a bit, and we're having trouble hearing.
5 years.
Oh no.
Linda, I would encourage you to stop sharing your camera, and maybe, oh yeah, we've lost her. She's gonna come back on.
All right. So please bear with us. I know this is one of our greatest fears. We talked prior to this presentation, and Linda said it's a backup plan if she disappears because of her bandwidth issues that just take over. So Linda, if you can hear me, just chime in when you're ready. I'm going to ask that we go. Well, can you hear me? There we go. You want to carry on, Linda? Okay.
You're on mute right now, Linda.
Go ahead, Steve.
Okay. So if we go to the next slide, please. So in Toronto, I've been the chairperson of the Toronto Indigenous Community Advisory Board. We've been around, oh my gosh, since before reaching home was a thing. I think it was back in the times when there was HPS, Homeless Partnering Strategy, and HPI, Homeless Partnering Initiative. So I think at least close to 13 years, we've had a community advisory board for the Indigenous community in Toronto. So it composed, our community advisory board is composed of all the following agencies here. And it looks like we have what, a dozen agencies there listed, all Indigenous agencies that are governed by Indigenous people. My phone is ringing. And then I don't know how to silence it, so I'll just let it ring until it stops. So the Community Advisory Board came together and helped collaborate on this application as well, with Meeting in the Middle. So if we go to the next slide as well. And also a collaboration of Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council, which NAMI-RES, where I work as a member of, along with 19 other member organizations. Yes, some of them are the same Indigenous organizations that are part of the Toronto Indigenous Community Advisory Board. So, we have some of the same players at the table here that represent both TASK and TCAB, as we call it in the acronyms. With TASK, they provide community-based research, policy, and advocacy on the social determinants of well-being for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people living in Toronto. And then I'll turn it over to Linda to share with us on the SSHA's role in this. Go next slide.
Thanks, Steve. Apologies for my terrible internet connection. Hopefully I can get through this. So as I said, I'm with Shelter Support and Housing Administration. It's a division of the City of Toronto. The City of Toronto is the service manager and community entity for homelessness and housing services for Toronto. And our work is directed by our Housing Stability Service Plan. And actually, just notably, we've just developed a new service plan, our Homelessness Solution Service Plan. Hopefully that gets approved by Toronto City Council. The previous strategic plan has a number of strategic directions and key actions that include improving access and equity, and accessible and responsive services for specific client groups, including Indigenous people, and strengthening partnerships and collaboration. And I didn't get a chance to at the beginning because I got cut off, but I was hoping to be able to acknowledge that Steve and I are working from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And just want to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. So I just realized that Marie is coming in from a different area, different traditional territory, so wanted to acknowledge that as well. Next slide.
Okay, is this one me, Linda? Yeah, I think it is. Okay, so our shared vision. So when we came together to help craft this document called Meeting in the Middle, we want it to be an engagement strategy and action plan to develop and foster better relationships between Indigenous organizations that work around the issues of homelessness and housing, and to make a better working relationship with Shelter Support Housing Administration, who administers a lot of the programs and funding for homeless programs in the city. So we wanted to build strong and sustainable relationships. And we thought this was foundational and needed to move the engagement strategy and action plan forward. I think working with Indigenous people from coast to coast to coast, it's fair to say that often we're relationship-based people. So, if you might be a municipal public servant and we don't necessarily know you, it's key to form that relationship. So I know often, some of the objectives that the municipalities have, just administer the funds and end homelessness and do good work, right? Well, that's great, but often we want to have a working relationship so we can build trust, so that we can, engage in a meaningful way, and that Indigenous people are not forgotten by some of the folks that work within the machinery of the municipality. I know in many cases in my career, there's been instances where, great coalitions have been struck and created, but often they're not created with Indigenous folks. And by the time the governance structures are set up and in place, there's no opportunity for Indigenous players to be in a leadership role. So I know when that happens, I keep away from it. I don't want to be involved. And nowadays, when that happens, I hold the players at the table accountable as well. And I've told them, quite frankly, I don't want to work with you because you didn't think of us in the beginning. So that's the way I've been looking at things. But with this agreement, it's to meaningfully address Indigenous homelessness in Toronto by addressing the City of Toronto Statement of Commitment and Guiding Principles to working with Aboriginal community, which is a piece of policy that was passed by the City of Toronto a number of years ago. So next slide, please. Is this you, Linda, or is this me?
I can take it.
Okay.
Thanks, Steve. So we know that Indigenous homelessness is a significant issue in Toronto, and it is across Canada. It's also a critical priority for the housing and homelessness sector. And, both groups have acknowledged that, the Indigenous partners and SSHA have acknowledged that we need to do things differently than we've done in the past if we're going to try to solve it. And so at the time when I think we sent these slides to Marie, it was right before we released the most recent street needs assessment results report. So we actually do have data on Indigenous homelessness, more recent data from 2021. Unfortunately, it still demonstrates the persistent overrepresentation of Indigenous people in Toronto's homeless population, making up this in 2021, it's 15% of the overall population of people experiencing homelessness. A little bit lower in terms of outdoor homelessness, 23% in 2021. Where everything seems to point to that decrease being the result of a lot of the good work that's done, has been done in collaboration with Indigenous organizations to house people and get them indoors who are staying outdoors. But still an overrepresentation regardless of the decrease in 2021. And we need to acknowledge that Indigenous homelessness and its risk factors can be directly traced to colonization, to government policies and practices such as residential school system, 60s scoop, institutional and structural racism, and intergenerational trauma that has been the result. And we've acknowledged that, we really try to acknowledge in SSHA that Indigenous-led solutions and meaningful and effective engagement with Indigenous organizations is really what's needed in order to solve this issue. So I'll turn it over to Steve.
So how we got here? Well, initially there was a lot of challenges in the past with Indigenous service providers and working in collaboration with SSHA. Sometimes they were planning directives that would affect the way Indigenous organizations would deliver our cultural services that had no input from Indigenous community members, or they would just come across as an authoritarian approach and not allow time for discussion or alternate ways of doing things. So a number of Indigenous community folks, myself included, pushed back a little bit. Said, we don't like this approach. We need to do things better. And we can do this in collaboration. So SSHA, with the support of local Indigenous organizations, recognized it was necessary to work together to meaningfully address Indigenous homelessness in Toronto. As a result of the challenges in meaningful engagement, both groups identified the need to further explore the understanding of self-determination and respectful consultation and collaboration. So that's what was the impetus to start this document called Meeting in the Middle. If we can go to the next slide, please. So in co-creating the Meeting in the Middle strategy, we did 3 different all day long planning sessions, and they weren't 3 consecutive days. They were spread out over time. And the consultants that we worked with, they did a little bit of homework in between and compiled some of the things that we said and came back to us. So we had 3 separate meetings, probably spread out over the span of 3 months. And we would meet in person. This is pre-pandemic, of course. We would meet in person at a really nice setting at a City of Toronto community center. It was by the lake. And we were fortunate enough to have senior management of SSHA be present for the meeting. And that spoke volumes to members of our community. It demonstrated that, hey, what we got here is important, that it seems to be important with some of the top officials within that city division, SSHA, and maybe we can get something accomplished here. So in 2016, Indigenous partners recommended that SSHA work with TASK to co-create the principles for engaging Indigenous communities and service providers. It was also suggested that the action plan be co-developed with timelines for achieving specific accomplishments and demonstrate action. We wanted to see achievable results, and we wanted to pinpoint what success would look like. And recognizing the importance of this document, both SSHA and TASK committed to having a 3-day facilitated consultation in September 18th, 19th, and 29th of 2017. Well, I guess I was wrong on the dates that was spread apart, but we did spread it out, and with SSHA and the leadership. The group of leaders served as a steering committee for developing the elements and priorities of the strategy. If we can go to the next slide, please. I'll turn it over to Linda.
Okay, thanks, Steve. But feel free to jump in. I feel like you have a lot
Okay.
better things to share than me. So please feel free to jump in. So basically, you know, we met, we gathered, we came up with kind of principles and actions in this engagement strategy and action plan. And then one of our Indigenous partners had recommended that we really honor the work by kind of launching it in a very public way in through an Indigenous birthing ceremony. So these are some of the pictures from the birthing of Meeting in the Middle. It was happening in June of 2018. It was a really lovely ceremony, kind of open to like a broader kind of audience. You know, we had an Indigenous midwife kind of facilitate that ceremony for us. There was a ceremony involving a bundle.
Yeah, bundle. Yep.
Steve, I know
Yeah.
you can speak better to this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we go ahead, Steve. I think I'm cutting
Okay.
out.
Okay. So for many of our members that helped co-create this document with the city officials from SSHA, we felt it was important that this document be a living document. And as such, we thought it would be most appropriate to have a birthing ceremony for this document for its unveiling. So it was tied to ceremony. We do have a bundle, or we refer to as a bundle, and this is it. This is some beautiful, colorful ribbons that the various folks that helped craft this document had been given, and they put their thoughts and feelings into this at that birthing ceremony, and their good intentions. So when we come together and have you know, annual meetings or biannual meetings, this bundle is exchanged. So the general manager, you know, I received this from her. She held it for the first while, and now myself as the chair of the Toronto Indigenous Community Advisory Board, I'm hanging on to this. So the next time we gather, we'll do another exchange, and they'll take turns to hang on to it and hold it for a little bit. So it's more or less a metaphor for the good intentions that were placed in this document at the birthing ceremony, and the intentions we had in place to work together more collaboratively, to have better working relationships, and all of this with the goal of ending Indigenous homelessness. So we can go to the next slide, please. So honoring relationships. So more or less, you know, we want to honor these relationships and rekindle these relationships we have with some of the senior staff at SSHA. You know, in having these in-person meetings with the senior management, we felt like we got to know them on a more personal level rather than just a professional. And it spoke volumes, and it demonstrated commitment from municipal public servants to work in collaboration with our community. And it allowed us to invest more in creating this working relationship with them, because they demonstrated the willingness to work with us. So it really spoke volumes. So now we rekindle that relationship every so often, biannually, about every 6 months. We're planning our biannual gathering, and we just had our annual gathering in the spring. So you know, we just when we honor those relationships, we'll come back together again. Sometimes there's new senior management from SSHA, and they'll get to know us, and same with the Indigenous community. Sometimes there's new organizational leaders that appear. So it's an opportunity for us to create those relationships and work more collaboratively together. So I'll turn over the next slide to Linda.
I'll try, Steve. You're never going to want to present with me again.
We're doing fine.
So as Steve mentioned, you know, one of the things we did to honor the relationship is we included in the strategy collective commitments that are shown on the slide that both SSHA and our Indigenous partners have agreed to uphold, as well as commitments. You know, we also have some commitments on the next couple of slides that are specific to SSHA staff and then specific to Indigenous organizations. And we've recommended that we all sort of review these commitments and accountability statements on a quarterly basis, and kind of do so at an individual and a team and an organization.
All right, thanks, Linda. Let me go to the next slide, please. Well, Linda, you want to take this one?
Sure, I'll try. So these are the some of the commitments that SSHA staff have agreed to uphold. So one is providing a land acknowledgement, acknowledging and challenging our power differentials and privilege. A lot of educating ourselves on the history and diversity of Indigenous people, participating in continuous cultural competency and cultural safety training, trying to challenge our systems to be more responsive and meet the needs of Indigenous organizations and clients, and being open to ceremony we're really trying very hard at SSHA to honor these commitments.
Thanks, Linda. And on the next slide, please. So the Indigenous organizations also agreed to commitments to relationship building, and this is the list of commitments that Indigenous organizations had agreed to. So it's to move away from historical grievances with SSHA and embrace a new way to work together. So I used to have a slew of stories that I could share, but I've agreed not to do it anymore because I'm not going to raise the historical grievances. I want to move forward in a more positive way. And as new grievances come up, well, I'm usually good at vocalizing those as well. But the cool thing is, with these new grievances, there's a commitment to resolve some of these things and deal with them in a constructive way. So it's being open to change and evolution. So, change is always constant no matter what sector you work in. And, so agreeing to roll with it and just adapt as we go along. Actively inviting SSHA to our agencies, events, and advisory meetings. So in our Toronto Indigenous Community Advisory Board, or TCAB as we call it for short, SSHA always has a standing agenda at every single one of our meetings. They're always invited. Linda is our key staff person there, but more recently too, we have other SSHA staff that are regulars at our TCAB meetings. We also invite them to organizational things. So for instance, at NamiRes, every year non-pandemic times, every year we host a large powwow at Fort York. And it's the biggest one in Toronto. And we always invite our friends from SSHA to come and join in and celebrate in the cultural dancing and singing and take part in the event. It's an open event to everybody. So we make sure to invite them to those sort of things. We also invite them to our annual general meetings, to be part of our governance structure and participate and witness it for themselves. The other thing we do is work, I guess, in a more collaborative way. And I know now our relationship is elevated to the point where I can just pick up the phone and call the general manager if I need to talk to them about something, or some of the upper management, or even Linda for that matter, if I have a big concern I need to address immediately. So that's really improved that relationship. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So upholding the City of Toronto Statement of Commitment to Aboriginal Communities. So this is a piece of municipal policy, I guess, that was adopted by the City of Toronto's Aboriginal Affairs Committee, which is a committee which is I guess an advisory to the Executive City Council. So we recognized back in 2014 that we needed to do things different with the municipal government of Toronto. So a number of us crafted the Statement of Commitment and Guiding Principles in working with Indigenous communities in Toronto. So we say communities because we're not just one community. There's several sectors within the Indigenous community. So we wanted to come up with commitments and things we could, in policy, hang our hats on. So, the City of Toronto has made a number of commitments in Toronto that recognizes Indigenous peoples' inherent rights to self-determination and autonomy. And thanks to the work of the Aboriginal Affairs Committee, the city adopted the Statement of Commitment in Aboriginal Communities of Toronto. And the City of Toronto recognizes the need to work with and learn and support Indigenous community partners. The action items in the Meeting in Middle Strategy and Action Plan are intended to honor and align with the city's commitments. And Indigenous partners are committed to supporting SSHA in implementing these commitments and actions by providing guidance and input and sharing information and resources with SSHA. So next slide, please. You want to take this one, Linda?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. So the next three slides that Steve and I are going to go through are the commitments in Meeting in the Middle and the actions that kind of underlie each of the commitments. And as Steve said, these commitments really are intended to honor the City of Toronto's Statement of Commitments to Aboriginal communities. So the three on this slide are around learning and development, integrating holistic approaches to policy and program development, and supporting capacity building of Indigenous organizations. So some of the work that we've done to implement these commitments is providing Indigenous cultural safety training to staff on a number of different phases. We just recently funded TASK to develop some Indigenous cultural safety training for the 2021 Street Needs Assessment. We've made that free. We paid TASK to basically have a license to have that broadly available for about a year. So that's free and it's online, you know, to support others in the sector, other staff working in the sector. We co-established a subcommittee of the Toronto Indigenous Community Advisory Board to guide the development and implementation of coordinated access. And so that group, you know, co-develops the agenda. You know, it's an extremely collaborative group that's working on coordinated access. And we've also signed a memorandum of understanding with our Indigenous partners to allocate 20% of our grants program funding to Indigenous organizations, and are working in collaboration with our partners to develop an Indigenous funding stream with that 20% set aside. So pass it to Steve for the next.
Okay, so next slide, please. So yeah, here's two more of the Meeting in the Middle commitments, and the key actions that were implemented to support these commitments included, you know, partnership with TCAB and TASK on the 2018 and 2021 Street Needs Assessment. So under this category, meaningful engagement, TCAB and TASK were meaningfully engaged to help with the more or less indigenizing the street needs assessment, you know, coming up with the training that Linda had mentioned for the folks going out and doing the surveys for the street needs assessment. You know, being a partner in the street needs assessment in terms of getting Indigenous staff to go out and do the surveys for the street needs assessment. You know, partnering with Indigenous organizations that may, you know, be doing work in the local correctional institutions to seek out Indigenous folks that might be homeless. So, you know, the coordination of project-specific engagement with TCAB and organizations was part of the meaningful engagement. There was a development of a guide for SSHA staff and outlining protocols and recommended practices for engaging Indigenous partners and communities. But since then too, SSHA has looked at their employment practices, and they recruited an Indigenous director that helps with some of the new developments around new shelters. They also dedicated a policy development officer position to support the Meeting in the Middle implementation. And they also recruited 3 Indigenous research associates with SSHA. So, you know, this engagement strategy also incorporated Indigenous folks being hired within the division to help support, I guess, meaningful engagement with Indigenous folks. So you can go to the next slide, please. You want to take this one, Linda?
Sure. So the last two commitments are around opportunities for collaboration and action and accountability. So, we've done a lot of broad sharing and dissemination with SSHA staff, city divisions, community partners around the process of co-creating meeting in the middle and lessons learned around establishing partnerships, which we're doing right now. Steve and I have probably done like 20 road shows already. So this is part of our commitment to kind of get the word out about, the good work that has gone into this strategy. And action and accountability, as Steve mentioned before, it was really important that this not be just a piece of paper or document that sits on the shelf, that there actually be some key actions and an accountability mechanism to ensure that we are, not forgetting about this and we are making progress on implementing the actions. And so, as Steve mentioned, we have a mid-year mid-year check-in where we kind of assess, the progress around implementation of the actions. We also have an annual gathering where we do the same, and also kind of recommitting to the relationship, making sure that there is progress being made on the actions and actions and commitments that are in meeting in the middle. I'll pass it over to Steve.
Okay, and the next slide, please. So right here, like sometimes births, there's a lot of sitting around and waiting. So if you're a family member or guest waiting for, one of your newest family members to be born. So this is a picture of people waiting for the birthing ceremony to take place. As I'd mentioned earlier, birthing the meeting in the middle strategy was a big deal. And here's a picture of some of the senior management from SSHA, as well as a number of executive directors from Indigenous organizations that work in the housing and homelessness sector. We came together to talk about this strategy, our intentions for it, and our commitment to work together to under this strategy to create better outcomes for Indigenous people that may experience homelessness. Birthing ceremonies usually involve months of preparation, living in a good way and following our teachings. We all gather to support this new being from the spirit world that's coming to live among us. So the first hands to hold them were our own hands, usually when a baby's born. The first words they hear are in our language. And their children are usually a special sacred gift. So we treated this birthing of this document in a similar manner. And we honor this agreement greatly. We pay tribute to the life givers who gave of themselves to create this document for community. So we bring gifts of food and the commitment to love and caring. So that's what took place in this birthing ceremony. A lot of goodwill and a lot of good intentions. So since this strategy has been birthed in this good way, we've seen a lot of good intentions. We've seen a lot of deliberate actions to help alleviate Indigenous homelessness within Toronto in collaboration with SSHA. I'm very pleased that we're able to create this document in collaboration because, if we didn't, I don't know if we would have been able to see a 1% drop within Indigenous homelessness in the last street needs assessment from the previous one. So I think that the strategy has really helped the Indigenous community a lot, which in turn helps Indigenous homeless folks. I know with the agreement to set aside 20% of all the homeless funds for the Indigenous community to make decisions over which organization should get funding, what kind of program should get the funding, whether the funding be capital or programs based. All those decision making is now in the hands of Indigenous service providers that comprise of the Toronto Indigenous Community Advisory Board. And it's not just the Reaching Home funds that this 20% set aside is consisted of. It's some of the provincial funds for homeless dollars as well. And I know within municipality of Toronto that this meeting in the middle engagement strategy is being looked at by other divisions within the city. And more recently, since this meeting in the middle document has come out. Members of Toronto Indigenous Community Advisory Board and Task, those that are housing providers, non-res being among them, are now working with the City of Toronto's Housing Secretariat to come up with a similar document, and it's a relationship document. So if we can go to the next slide, please. You able to take this, Linda? Okay, I'll jump in here. So this is a photo of us from our first gathering. And as you can see, there's a photo of all of us sticking our arms together. It signifies us meeting in the middle, or putting our hands in the middle at least. And if you notice, it's in person. We had this meeting in person. It was pre-pandemic times. And then if you notice the next slide that took place in November 2020, our annual meeting was done virtually. It was in the heat of the pandemic. I think that would have been our second wave, third wave, maybe. I forget all these waves. Anyway, so we had to do it virtually. And so again, you see members of the Indigenous community as well as members of SSHA all in that photo shot. And it looks like some were brave to show their faces and some decided to turn off their camera. Maybe it was bandwidth issues. So, so far we've been living up to the commitments of meeting in the middle and having these gatherings and coming together. Usually there's opportunities for both parties to evaluate how they feel their relationship is moving forward and coming along. It's also opportunities for both parties to be critical and share areas where improvement is needed, so that we can, maybe rekindle those relationships and commit to working together more collaboratively. So you go to the next slide and I'll turn it over to Linda.
Thanks, Steve. And I wanted to add too that for our annual gathering, the last one that we had the honor of having our city manager and deputy city manager there, which spoke volumes to the city's commitment to building relationships with Indigenous organizations and communities. And I think everybody was really honored that they took the time to be there and really were interested in kind of how the city can support this work and broader kind of reconciliation efforts. So this is a picture from our mid-year check-in, and as Steve said, unfortunately, our annual gathering, upcoming annual gathering is going to have to gather again. And then the final slide, I don't know if I'm cutting out or not. Steve, feel free to jump in.
Okay. So this is
finals.
Well, you are cutting out a little bit, Linda. So this is the final slide. This is what the cover of the document looks like. It's online as well. I have a few copies of the paper stuff here, and I often refer to it at times. This is really fabulous that we were able to come together to create this. It more or less, sets up, the terms and conditions on how we're going to work together. It emphasizes the importance of relationships. And as I'd mentioned earlier, a lot of Indigenous folks are relationship people. So, for me, it's common sometimes to reach out to, managers that we collaborate with within the SSHA and say, hey, let's go for a coffee. Let's meet. I know in pandemic times, it's usually let's meet over Zoom and have a coffee on Zoom. Or I know lately too, I got really excited. I had one senior manager from SSHA that I wanted to meet with over some new directives that had implications on our service delivery. So I said, hey, let's meet for a coffee somewhere. I'll meet you outside in a park. And it was so nice to meet an actual person in person outside in a park. It felt really good. It made it to be a really good day for me. So yeah, so I think because of the strategy, we have commitment to building relationships and doing it in a good way. And for more information, the meeting in the middle document is available at this link at the City of Toronto website, toronto.ca housing research. I believe it's also on the task webpage, TASSC, task. Toronto Aboriginal Social Services Council is the acronym. So You can find it at either one of those web pages. I know for a number of municipalities, sometimes it's a struggle to engage Indigenous people, maybe not know where to begin. So best way to begin is just reach out and have a conversation. Too many times in my career and working in this field, I've seen different well-meaning groups come together that may want to alleviate homelessness, and they're great at collaborating with each other. But when it comes to Indigenous organizations, they don't seem to engage early enough, and at times I get really upset and disappointed, even angry, because I know there's been some key groups where I would have loved to have contributed, but this notion that we're an afterthought seemed very apparent, where they would set up a meeting and start a very grassroots approach, and then become formalized and maybe even become incorporated. And then after they've set up their incorporation process and set up their board chairs and all that and have their government structure in place, only then have they invited Indigenous folks to come at the table. And I find that personally very insulting. And I've been very vocal about that. So one tip to take away from this is, if you're going to engage Indigenous folks, don't hesitate to do it early. Don't wait to set up your governance structure. Do it right away. I won't sit at some of these tables if we're not actively engaged and respected that way. So, and also, if I've told them, you can't call yourselves inclusive because you're not inclusive of Indigenous folks. You didn't think of us right from the get-go. And yeah, so please try to be inclusive, engage early, and please look at this document if you need help. So we can go to the next slide. Do you have any more to add, Linda? No? Okay.
No, I'm good. Thanks, Steve.
Okay, so the next slide says Chimigwech, which means thank you in Ojibwe. Nyawin Kowa, which in Mohawk language means thank you. Marci in the Métis language, as well as French, I hear, means thank you. And thank you in the language we're all speaking, where we're able to communicate to all each other and understand each other, is in English. So Miigwech, everybody. And if you'd like to learn more about meeting in the middle and 10 tips for engagement Indigenous partners and protocols and practices for meeting engagement, please visit the website. So is there any questions or comments?
Thanks so much, Steve and Linda. That was really amazing, and what such a great process and amazing model for other communities. And I was so this 10 tips for engagement and your protocols and practices, these are additional documents or resources that you have on your website. Okay, I'm super excited to learn about those. Didn't know that they were there, and want to pull them in and help promote those as well. So again, thank you for all this work and resources that you're willing and able to share with others. I will be watching and encourage people in the Q&A or the chat to ask questions, but I certainly have some that I was wondering if I could get your thoughts on and get started with. I'm wondering, what was your biggest learnings sort of through this process?
I guess for me, when we first entered into the meetings around meeting in the middle, I didn't come there with any high hopes whatsoever. I had no expectations. In fact, I was rather skeptical that we'd get anywhere. And if I was able to share past grievances, you'd probably understand why. But I was pleasantly surprised that there actually is commitment coming from the general manager of this division within the city of Toronto, all the way down to some of the other managers, to work in a more collaborative manner. It really changed things in how we work together. This meeting in the middle engagement strategy and action plan, it set the groundwork for negotiating the 20% set aside of all of the SSHA's homeless dollars for the Indigenous community to make decisions on, to practice self-determination. So it worked very well. It far exceeded whatever expectations I had going into this, where I started very skeptical. You have any takeaways from this, Linda?
I do. I feel like I've learned a lot from this process. One, I think, I think I'm cutting out now, so I'm not sure if you can hear the relationships. That is a big one that I've learned. It's much easier to engage and sort of consult on something when you have an existing relationship. I feel like now I can call Steve up and just say, "Hey, Steve, what do you think about this?" And it's not kind of taken in an authentic sort of way. So I do think that was really an important learning for me. The other one is around listening. I think that a lot of non-Indigenous people do a lot of talking at meetings and consultations. And I think that it's, I really learned that we need to kind of, be quiet and listen and hear what the concerns are and work, really hard to kind of try to address those. There's a really important role for allies to play. It's not an Indigenous issue to be solved by Indigenous people. Us allies do have a role to support. So I think those are kind of my key learnings.
That's great, thank you. And I remember this report coming out and looking at it online and looking at thinking I would find also some like technical kind of like, what are we going to do around homelessness, and I was so I just thought it was so amazing that it really started with this engagement and relationship building approach. And I'm wondering if other people were doing a strategy like this, how helpful, and how did you choose a consultant? Like, how important was that to sort of the process?
Okay, well, I think for the consultant, when we chose a consultant, we wanted to be an Indigenous consultant who could work well with our friends and partners from the city of Toronto. So we know someone who was quite phenomenal, who was really inspiring, that had very creative ways to work with us and draw out, I guess, some of the objectives that we wanted to achieve. So we sole sourced the consultant because we felt it was important to find the right person rather than issuing an RFP and having to wait for a while. So we found an Indigenous consultant who had all the right skills to help make this happen. So that's how we sought out that person. And then I guess as a helper too, we had a task staff person also be the key person for note taking. And I know when we come back together, she would always clarify some of the key points if she didn't quite understand things. So that was also important.
And I'm wondering, from the commitments that were made, were there some sort of that were easier to follow than others? Are there things that you're particularly still working on?
Well, some of the commitments, I'll just jump in. I know that there's different commitments or statements of accountability, such as what Linda had mentioned earlier on the land acknowledgement, acknowledge power differentials and privileges that affect relationship building that maybe others may not think of or even consider before engaging with Indigenous folks. So some of these came out quite organically, but some of them were also borrowed from, the City of Toronto's statement of commitment to Aboriginal communities. So, for instance, commitments 1 through 7 were more or less excerpts of that, with more descriptors on how these commitments will be achieved through SSHA and working with Indigenous community. So, and it's not just all on SSHA. We both have clear roles to play in this, and we all acknowledge that. And I think to create a true partnership, you need that. It can't be just all one-sided. It has to be give and take both ways, just like a relationship, right? So, if you want to create a good relationship, you put good things into it, you commit to things, and you uphold those commitments. Otherwise, your partner gets upset, right? So, that's how these commitments came to me.
And I think some of the, some commitments that we have, given that, we're municipal government. We're working within all these kind of legislative and funding constraints. So, there was a little more work to kind of implement some of the commitments around the funding allocation, still kind of challenged around the development of a day-to-day respect, but they're not insurmountable either. I see them cutting out again. They're not insurmountable. Yeah, we've worked through them. We've worked within the kind of constraints, and we've tried to kind of push as much as we can. Sometimes acknowledging that maybe we can't do certain things because we have requirements.
Yeah. So I know some instances where there was some of the commitments we wanted to achieve, and being, I guess, risk adverse. Sometimes we had to double check. Can we do this? Let's check with the city legal department. I know SSHA did that on their end. See if we can make this happen. So there's been a little bit of that as well. But clearly, right from the get-go, when these requests come forward from both sides, there's always been commitment to work together. Sometimes you just gotta, double check things to make sure it's workable.
Yeah. It's helpful to hear that, there may be challenges, and there probably will be challenges, but you can work through them. You can talk transparently about them. It's not insurmountable. It might take some time, but you've really kept at it. What has been sort of the most important part, do you think, in kind of keeping the document alive?
From my perspective, I've been with NAMIRES now for 13 years. In my time being here, I've seen 3 general managers for SSHA come and go. I know when there's a change in management, sometimes it's a change in work styles. There's a change in how they apply policy and implement it. So this is something we can hang our hat on, regardless if senior management changes at SSHA. These commitments are still there. The policy that it quotes from City Hall is still there. So it's more or less a roadmap, I guess, on how we're going to relate with each other. So I find that very handy, very helpful, so that if there is a change in senior management, we still have this commitment to work collaboratively together. This document also highlights, the importance of the relationship. For me, relationship building is key.
And I'm wondering, what would you say about a community that's already started down the road of implementing coordinated access, and they have not, they haven't gone through a process like this, and they're already partway down the road? Like, what would you recommend to them now? How can they make amends? How can they, bring in Indigenous partners when they haven't, really started from where you've started here?
From my perspective, and it's just mine, and I think if there is instances where they've already gone down that road a little bit, I'd probably acknowledge that, hey, we didn't, reach out to your members of your community right away. We're sorry, that was an oversight. We want to engage you in this because we see you as meaningful partners in helping alleviate homelessness, particularly for Indigenous people who, often are overrepresented in that population. So that's, I think, how you would engage with Indigenous folks in other regions who may not have been engaged already, and allow space for them to be at the table. I guess engage them in what's been created so far, see if they're okay with it. If not, maybe allow room for adjustments. Also keeping in mind, Indigenous, I guess, funding holders like our TCAB, we also hold funds for the Indigenous funding for Reaching Home. Okay, so we have our own pot of funding already. Mind you, it's way smaller than what the city delivers, but we still have that. So groups like our TCAB, our Toronto Indigenous Community Advisory Board, we're not required to follow through on coordinated access. we're doing it because I think it's wise to do that. And you need to measure, you know, success and understand what success looks like. So we're on board with this. So also keep in mind that, you know, Indigenous groups like our TCAB, you know, they're not necessarily required to follow all the objectives of reaching home, because there are some allowances for Indigenous folks not to follow this.
That's great. Thank you for those thoughts. I just realized I got like so excited about asking you questions that we've gone like a tiny bit over time, and I apologize for that, but I do just want to launch this poll. We'd love to get people's feedback on the presentation today. And while that's happening, Steve and Linda, just any final words of, I guess, encouragement or advice that you would give to other communities who are listening?
I would say when you're engaging the Indigenous community, just be authentic, be your real self. You know, be humble, don't come across as an authoritarian. You know, too many times our community members have experienced folks that are experts that seem to think they know what's best for our community. And, you know, in the experience of colonialism, they've been, you know, terribly wrong. So don't come across as an expert, just be humble and be your real authentic self.
And I would say, you know, again, my connection is unstable. I don't know if you can hear this or not, but seems like every time I unmute myself, it goes unstable. But I would say that, you know, relationship building is a continual process. So it's not just build a relationship and then it's there and then you never kind of meet and kind of gather. It is continual and it needs to be nurtured and fostered. And you know that has to be done. It's just not just a one-time thing. And so I would say, you know, start building relationships now. And there's a lot of work that has to be done to continue to maintain and nurture those relationships.
That's great. Well, I want to thank you both very much for the gift of your time and really for this example and gift of, you know, the work that you've done. I think, you know, it really has shows a pathway that other communities can take in undertaking this work as well. So again, thank you for all of that and for your time today and presenting, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.